The morning air in Paris carried the scent of freshly baked bread and horse manure, a combination so familiar to Lisa that she barely noticed it anymore. She walked briskly along the Rue Saint-Honore, her worn leather shoes clicking against the uneven cobblestones, her gray-blue dress swaying just above her ankles. The sky hung low and heavy with clouds, casting that peculiar diffused light that made the limestone facades of the grand buildings glow pale and ghostly. She clutched a woven basket filled with fresh linen she'd just collected from the laundress, the fabric still warm and smelling of lye soap. At 19, Lisa had learned to make herself invisible. It was a survival skill for someone of her station, a young woman who worked for whichever aristocratic household needed an extra pair of hands that week. She kept her eyes lowered, her posture respectful but not servile, and she moved through the world like water finding its path around stones. Her chestnut-brown hair always pulled into a simple low bun with a few rebellious strands framing her delicate face. Caught the morning light as she passed beneath the iron balconies that jutted from the upper floors of the elegant shops. The street was already alive with activity. Merchants were arranging their wares in front of brightly painted storefronts. A carriage rattled past, its wheels clattering loudly, and inside she caught a glimpse of a powdered wig and a flash of emerald silk. The aristocracy was beginning its daily ritual of being seen, of parading through the approved spaces of Paris where they could admire each other's wealth and position. Elise had often wondered what it must be like to have so much time, to fill one's days with nothing more pressing than choosing which jewels to wear or which café to visit. She turned onto a narrower side street heading toward the home of Madame Beaumont, a minor noblewoman who'd hired her for the week to help prepare for a dinner party. As she walked, her mind drifted, as it so often did, to her brother Thomas. It had been 3 years since the fever took him. 3 years since she'd watched him struggle for breath in their tiny attic room above a tannery. Thomas had been born deaf, and in their childhood Lisa had invented a simple language of gestures so they could talk to each other. Their mother had thought it foolish, a waste of time, but to Elise those conversations with her brother had been sacred. He'd taught her to see the world differently, to notice the things that didn't make sound, the way light moved across a wall, the patterns in falling snow, the expressions that flickered across people's faces when they thought no one was watching. The memory made her chest tighten, and she quickened her pace, trying to outrun the grief that still ambushed her in quiet moments. She delivered the linens to Madame Beaumont's townhouse, endured the woman's sharp inspection and sharper tongue, and then was dismissed for the rest of the morning. The dinner party wasn't until evening, and she wouldn't be needed until then to help serve. Elise decided to walk to the Marché aux Fleurs on the Isle de la Cite. She had a few spare coins, and the flower market always lifted her spirits. The morning had grown warmer, though the clouds remained, and as she crossed the bridge over the Seine, she paused to watch the river slide past, gray-green and eternal, carrying small boats and the occasional piece of debris downstream. The water had witnessed centuries of this city's life, and she found something comforting in its indifference. The flower market was a riot of color and scent when she arrived. Wooden stalls with striped awnings lined the square, and metal buckets overflowed with roses, peonies, lavender, and flowers whose names she didn't know. The vendors called out their prices, their voices competing with each other in a cheerful cacophony. Lisa wandered between the stalls, letting her fingers brush against soft petals, breathing in the perfume that seemed to exist in defiance of the gray sky above. She was examining a bucket of white roses when she noticed the commotion. A cluster of well-dressed people had gathered near the edge of the market, their voices rising in that particular tone of aristocratic disdain mixed with entertainment. Elise's curiosity got the better of her, and she moved closer, using her practiced invisibility to slip between the bodies until she could see what had captured their attention. A woman stood at the center of the crowd, and even if Elise hadn't been able to see her elaborate dresses, stunning creation in deep violet, with gold embroidery that caught what little light filtered through the clouds, she would have known the woman was nobility. Everything about her proclaimed it, the way she held herself with that perfect, upright posture that came from years of training, the pale, pampered skin that had never known a day of labor, the jewels that glittered at her throat and ears. Her hair was an elaborate confection of honey-blonde curls arranged in the Rococo style, though Lisa could see threads of silver at her temples. She looked to be in her early 40s, and there was something striking about her face-high cheekbones, a delicate jaw, and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything with an intensity that made Lisa shiver. The woman was trying to communicate with a flower vendor, but something was clearly wrong. She gestured emphatically at a display of pink peonies, but her gestures seemed strange, disconnected from the normal flow of conversation. The vendor, a heavy-set man with a red face and a stained apron, was growing increasingly frustrated. He spoke loudly, as if volume alone could bridge whatever gap existed between them, and the aristocrats watching laughed at the spectacle. Then Elise understood. The woman couldn't hear him. She was deaf. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and suddenly she was 8 years old again, watching strangers mock Thomas in the market because he couldn't respond to their questions, because his silence made them uncomfortable, because cruelty comes easily when you don't understand. One of the watching nobles, a portly man with a ridiculous powdered wig and a burgundy velvet coat that strained across his belly, stepped forward with a smirk. Elise recognized him as Monsieur Philippe Laurent, a minor count who was known for his cutting wit and his casual cruelty. She'd served at a dinner party at his home once, and she'd watched him humiliate a young footman who'd spilled wine, reducing the boy to tears while the other guests laughed. "Perhaps she'd understand if you used smaller words, my good man," Laurent said loudly, and the crowd tittered. "Although I'm not sure the Countess de Valois understands much of anything these days. A shame, really. Her family was quite distinguished before nature proved unkind." The Countess turned her penetrating gaze on Laurent, and even though she couldn't have heard his words, Elise saw her face tighten. She understood the mockery, if not the specifics. Her hand moved to the ornate fan hanging from her wrist, and she opened it with a sharp snap, holding it in front of her face. It was a gesture Elise recognized from her time serving the nobility, a way of signaling displeasure, of creating a barrier. But here in this moment it felt like something else. It felt like armor. Elise didn't think. If she had, she probably would have talked herself out of what she did next. But Thomas's face was in her mind, and the memory of his loneliness, and the way strangers had treated him like he was stupid or broken just because he experienced the world differently. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the indignant exclamations as she jostled silk-clad elbows and stepped on polished shoes. She stopped in front of the Countess, and before she could lose her courage, she raised her hands and began to sign. It was the simple language she developed with Thomas. Nothing as sophisticated as what she'd heard existed in some places, but it was something. She pointed to the peonies, then made the gesture for beautiful that Thomas had loved, a hand moving up past her face, fingers spreading like light. Then she pointed to the Countess and made the gesture for want, a pulling motion toward the body. The effect was immediate and profound. The Countess's eyes widened, and her fan dropped to her side. Her mouth opened slightly in an expression of pure shock. For a long moment she simply stared at Elise, and in that stare Elise saw a hunger so intense it made her want to weep. It was the hunger of someone who'd been stranded on an island seeing a ship on the horizon. It was recognition. The crowd had fallen silent. Even Monsieur Laurent seemed at a loss for words, his mouth hanging open in a way that would have been comical if the moment weren't so charged with emotion. The Countess raised her own hands, slowly, almost reverently. She pointed to herself, then brought her hand to her heart. Then she pointed to Lisa and made a gesture, spreading her hands outward, palms up. Even though it wasn't one of the signs Lisa and Thomas had used, the meaning was clear. "Thank you." Or perhaps, "Who are you?" Elise felt tears prick her eyes. She signed her name as best she could, the letters of the alphabet that Thomas had taught her, making each letter with her fingers. Elise. The Countess watched intently, and then she smiled. It transformed her face completely, erasing the hauteur and the loneliness and leaving something radiant and youthful. "This is absurd," Laurent's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "You there, girl? Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? You cannot simply approach the Countess de Valois as if you were equals." The presumption, but the Countess turned to him, and the look she gave him could have frozen the sane in midsummer. She said something, and though her voice was strange, too loud in some places, soft in others, the vowels not quite right, the words were clear enough. "Leave her alone." Laurent's face flushed red, clashing horribly with his burgundy coat. "My lady, I merely—" The Countess turned away from him, dismissing him as completely as if he'd ceased to exist, and turned back to Elise. She gestured again, more urgently this time, and Elise understood she was asking something. The vendor, forgotten in all of this, cleared his throat. "The Vowers, miss," he said quietly to Elise, his earlier frustration replaced by something like awe. "I think she wants to know how much they cost." Elise signed the price, a complicated combination of number signs she and Thomas had developed, and the Countess nodded. She reached into a small silk purse that hung from her wrist and pulled out far more coins than the peonies were worth. She handed them to the vendor, who took them with shaking hands. Then she gestured for Elise to take the flowers. "Oh, no, my lady," Elise said, shaking her head. I couldn't, but the Countess was insistent. She pressed the peonies into Elisa's arms, and then she did something that made the remaining crowd gasp. She took Elisa's hand, her bare, aristocratic hand touching the work-roughened hand of a servant hand. She held it for a moment. Her eyes, those striking, pale blue eyes, seemed to communicate everything she couldn't say. I see you. I understand. Thank you for seeing me. Then she released Elisa's hand, gathered her violet skirts, and walked away, her posture as regal as any queen's. Her lady's maid, who'd been hovering at the edge of the crowd looking mortified, hurried after her. The aristocrats parted to let her pass, and Elise could hear their whispers starting already, the scandal of what had just occurred rippling outward like rings in water. Elise stood holding the peonies, their scent sweet and overwhelming, and watched the Countess disappear into a waiting carriage. The crowd began to disperse, some of them shooting her dark looks, others seeming curious. Monsieur Laurent paused as he passed her, his small eyes cold. "You've made a spectacle of yourself and insulted the natural order," he said quietly, his voice dripping with venom. "The Countess may have been charmed by your little performance, but others will not be. Remember your place, girl." He swept away, and Elise was left alone with the vendor, who was staring at the coins in his hand as if they might disappear. "I've never seen anything like that," he murmured. "Never in all my years. The way you talked to her with your hands. It was like magic." Lisa shook her head, clutching the peonies. "Not magic, just ... understanding." She left the market, her mind reeling. She should have felt afraid. Laurent's threat had been clear, and she'd violated so many unspoken rules that she couldn't begin to count them. But instead, she felt something else. She felt alive in a way she hadn't since Thomas died. She felt like maybe, just maybe, his death hadn't been meaningless. He'd taught her how to communicate with silence, and today that knowledge had built a bridge across an impossible distance. She didn't know then that this was just the beginning, that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine, that the simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about duty, class, and the power of human connection. All she knew was that for the first time in 3 years she felt like she had a purpose beyond survival. The clouds finally broke as she walked home, and weak sunlight filtered through, turning the gray stones of Paris to gold. Lisa lifted her face to it, the peonies heavy in her arms, and allowed herself to hope. The next morning Lisa woke before dawn in the tiny room she rented above a bakery. The space was barely large enough for her narrow bed and a small trunk that held all her worldly possessions. But it was hers, and it was better than the alternatives. The smell of baking bread rose through the floorboards, warm and yeasty, and she lay for a moment in the half-light, thinking about the previous day. She'd expected to feel regret, or at least anxiety about the consequences of her actions, but instead she felt a strange, quiet joy. She kept seeing the Countess's face, that moment of shock giving way to recognition and gratitude. She wondered what the woman's life was like, surrounded by people who couldn't or wouldn't learn to communicate with her. Trapped in a world of silence while everyone around her talked and laughed and made plans without including her. Elise dressed quickly in her other work dress, this one a faded blue that had been gray once, but had taken on a softer hue through countless washings. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and descended the narrow stairs to the street. She had no work scheduled today, which meant she'd have to spend the morning looking for odd jobs. Perhaps at the market or helping one of the merchants with their inventory. The streets were quieter at this hour, the aristocrats still asleep in their feather beds while the working people of Paris began their day. Elise joined the flow of servants, laborers, and tradespeople, all moving with purpose through the awakening city. She was heading toward the market when she noticed a fine carriage stopped ahead, blocking part of the narrow street. The driver was arguing with a cart driver who was trying to pass, both men gesturing dramatically in that very Parisian way that turned every disagreement into theater. Elise was about to turn down a side street to avoid the commotion when the carriage door opened and a figure stepped out. Even before she could see clearly, something made her stop. The dress was a deep blue today, almost the color of midnight, with silver embroidery that caught the early light. The Countess de Valois looked around the street with that same intense gaze Elise remembered. And then, impossibly, those pale blue eyes found hers in the crowd. The Countess's face lit up with recognition and something that looked almost like relief. She gestured to someone inside the carriage, and a woman emerged, her lady's maid, Elise assumed. A stern-looking woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back severely from her face. The Countess pointed directly at Lisa and said something to the maid, her voice still strange and oddly pitched but determined. The maid approached Lisa with a look of deep disapproval. "You are the girl from yesterday?" she asked, her tone making it clear what she thought of the whole situation. "The one who made gestures at the Countess?" "Ah, yes, madame," Elise said, her heart beginning to race. Had she been wrong? Was she about to be punished after all? "The Countess wishes to speak with you. You will come with us." It wasn't a request. Elise glanced at the Countess, who was watching with an expression of hopeful anxiety, and found she couldn't refuse. She nodded and followed the maid to the carriage. As she climbed inside, she was overwhelmed by the scent of perfume and the feel of velvet upholstery. She'd never been inside such a vehicle before when nobles needed her to travel with them. She rode up top with the driver or walked alongside. The Countess was sitting across from her and in the close confines of the carriage. Elise could see details she'd missed before. There were fine lines around the woman's eyes, and her hands, though elegant, showed the slight tremor of nervousness. She gestured to the seat, indicating Elise should sit, and then she began to sign, not the signs Elise had used, but her own gestures, urgent and seeking. "I don't understand, my lady," Elise said softly. "I'm sorry. I only know the signs I used with my brother," and the Countess's expression shifted to frustration, and she turned to her maid, speaking in that strange voice. The maid sighed heavily, clearly uncomfortable with her role as interpreter. "The Countess wishes to know where you learned to do that thing with your hands. She says no one has ever been able to communicate with her that way before, except for her childhood nurse who died many years ago." Elise felt her throat tighten. "My brother Thomas was born deaf. I created signs so we could talk to each other. He died 3 years ago." The maid translated, and the Countess's face crumpled for just a moment before she regained her composure. She reached across and took Elise's hand again, squeezing it gently. Then she began signing again, slowly and deliberately. And this time Elise understood she was showing her signs, the Countess's own language. Developed in isolation, different from Elise's, but similar enough that with attention they might understand each other. For the next several minutes, as the carriage sat stationary on the Paris street and the driver waited patiently above, the Countess and Elise taught each other their respective languages. The maid watched with an expression that shifted from disapproval to something like wonder. It was slow and sometimes frustrating, but gradually they found common ground. The Countess signed something, and the maid translated. "She says she's been alone for 20 years, since she lost her hearing to scarlet fever when she was 22. Her family was ashamed. They kept her isolated, and after they died she inherited the title and the house, but no one at court wanted to speak to a deaf woman. She reads lips when she can, but so few people have the patience." Elise's heart ached. "I'm so sorry, my lady." The Countess shook her head vehemently and signed something with great emphasis. The maid hesitated before translating. She says you gave her hope yesterday. She saw you in the crowd, just another face in the mob that was laughing at her, and then you stepped forward and treated her like a person, like someone worth communicating with. She says she hasn't felt human in a very long time." "Of course you're human," Elise said, forgetting protocol, forgetting the vast gulf between their stations. "Of course you are. The way people treat you is wrong. It's cruel." The Countess smiled, tears gleaming in her eyes. She signed again, and this time Elise understood without translation. "Thank you." Then the Countess became more animated, signing rapidly. The maid translated, though her tone suggested she thought her employer was making a terrible mistake. "The Countess wishes to hire you. She wants you to come to her home, to be her companion. She'll pay you more than you could make in a year as a housemaid. She just wants someone who can communicate with her, someone who treats her as human." Elise's mind reeled. It was impossible. It was scandalous. It violated every rule of society. A common serving girl couldn't become a companion to a countess. The nobility would be outraged. And yet, looking at the hope in the Countess's eyes, at the desperate loneliness that lurked behind her aristocratic poise, Elise found she couldn't say no. "I would be honored, my lady," she said quietly. The Countess's smile was radiant. She signed something that Elise didn't quite catch, but the maid translated with obvious reluctance. "She says you've saved her life." As the carriage finally began to move, carrying Elise toward a future she could never have imagined, she thought about Thomas again, about how he'd been dismissed and mocked and treated as less than human because of his deafness, about how he'd died alone except for her in a cold room with so much left unsaid even between them. Maybe this was why she'd learned to sign. Maybe all of it, the grief, the loneliness, the memories that still woke her in the night, maybe it had been preparing her for this moment, for the chance to give someone else what she hadn't been able to fully give her brother, a voice in the silence, a bridge across the isolation. The Countess's home in the Maid district was everything Elise had imagined and nothing she'd expected. From the outside, the Hotel Particulier was imposing, a limestone facade, 3 stories tall with tall windows, intricate iron balconies, and a heavy wooden door studded with brass. Inside it was both grand and melancholy. The entrance hall had soaring ceilings painted with faded frescoes, a chandelier that probably hadn't been lit in years, and an air of disuse that no amount of dusting could quite dispel. The maid, who'd finally introduced herself as Madame de Clos, led Elise through rooms that seemed frozen in time. Furniture sat under holland covers like sleeping ghosts. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors looked down from the walls with disapproving eyes. Quote, everything was beautifully maintained but empty of life, a monument to a family that had faded, to a woman who lived here more as a prisoner than a resident. The Countess takes her meals in the small salon, Madame de Clos explained as they climbed the stairs. Her tone had warmed slightly, though she still seemed uncertain about this entire arrangement. She rarely entertains. After the first few years of people's cruelty, she stopped trying. She has the house, the money, but what good is any of it when you're alone? Elise was given a room on the 2nd floor, near the Countess's own chambers. It was larger than any room she'd ever had, with a real bed, not just a mattress on the floor, a wardrobe, a writing desk by the window, and even a fireplace. The window looked out over a small garden that had once been formal but now grew somewhat wild. Roses climbing over a stone wall and a profusion of white and pink blooms. You'll be expected to spend most days with the Countess, Madame de Clos continued. She wants ... company. Conversation. I don't know how you'll manage it, but that's what she wants. You'll take meals with her, accompany her on walks in the garden. Read to her, though how you'll read to someone who can't hear, I don't know. Perhaps you'll work it out together. That afternoon, after Lisa had washed and changed into a simple dress that Madame de Clos had found for her still servant's clothing, but finer than what she'd owned, she was led to the small salon. The room was painted in pale yellows and creams, with windows that let in the gray Parisian light. The Countess was sitting in a chair by the fireplace, still wearing her elaborate blue dress, a book open in her lap, though she didn't appear to be reading. When Elise entered, the Countess rose immediately, her face bright with an emotion that looked almost like joy. She signed something, and Elise was pleased to find she understood most of it. Welcome. I'm so glad you came. Elise signed back, using a combination of her signs and the ones the Countess had taught her. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. For a moment they just stood there, 2 women from completely different worlds, brought together by chance and loneliness and the simple human need to be understood. Then the Countess gestured to the chair across from hers, and they sat. Over the next several hours they began the real work of learning to communicate. The Countess was intelligent and patient, and she'd clearly spent years observing people, learning to read lips and body language to compensate for what she couldn't hear. Together they created a hybrid language, some of Elise's signs, some of the Countess's own gestures, some new inventions they created together. They gave each other names and sign. For Elise, a gesture like a flower blooming because the Countess said her kindness had reminded her that beauty still existed. For the Countess, a gesture like opening a book, because she loved to read and because she signed. She felt like her life was finally beginning a new chapter. They talked about their lives. The Countess, who insisted that in private, Elise should call her Marguerite, had been born into a prominent family, educated by the finest tutors, groomed for a brilliant marriage. Then the scarlet fever had come when she was 22, burning through her for weeks, and when she survived, her hearing was gone. The young nobleman who'd been courting her disappeared immediately. Her parents, horrified by what they saw as a defect, withdrew her from society. She'd spent the next 20 years in increasing isolation, her parents dying one by one, her siblings moving away, until she was alone in this big house with only servants who spoke to her through written notes or not at all. I read she signed to Lisa as the afternoon light began to fade. I read everything: philosophy, poetry, novels, history. I taught myself English and Italian from books. I tried to improve my mind since I couldn't improve my condition. But books are no substitute for human connection. Elise told her about Thomas, about growing up poor, about the dozen different jobs she'd worked since her mother died when she was 16. She told Marguerite about the way people had treated Thomas, the casual cruelty of strangers who couldn't be bothered to see past his disability. Society treats us both as less than human, Marguerite signed. You because you were born poor, me because I became deaf. We're both invisible in different ways. It was the most honest conversation Elise had ever had with anyone except her brother. Class and circumstance had made them strangers, but their shared experience of being dismissed and devalued had made them equals. That first day set the pattern for the ones that followed. Lisa woke early in her comfortable new room, dressed, and went to Marguerite's chambers. They breakfasted together in the small salon, and Elise learned to describe the taste of food in signs, the buttery richness of croissants, the bitter comfort of coffee, the sweetness of jam. Then they might walk in the garden, Marguerite pointing out plants and flowers, Elise creating new signs for their names and characteristics. In the afternoons, Elise would read aloud from books while also signing the words, so Marguerite could both watch her lips and follow the gestures. It was exhausting work, but it felt purposeful in a way that scrubbing floors and polishing silver never had. In the evenings, they often just sat together in companionable silence. Marguerite doing embroidery or writing letters. Elise reading or practicing her letters. Marguerite had insisted on teaching her to read and write better, saying that if she was going to be a proper companion, she needed to be educated. Madame de Clos watched it all with a mixture of disapproval and cautious hope. She'd served the Countess for 15 years, had watched her employer's slow retreat from the world, and though she would never admit it, she was glad to see Marguerite smiling again, engaged with life in a way she hadn't been in years. 2 weeks passed in this way, and Elise began to believe that maybe this could work, that maybe she'd found a place where she belonged. Then Monsieur Laurent came to call. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Elise and Marguerite were in the music room on the second floor. The room held a beautiful harpsichord that hadn't been played in years, and Marguerite had been signing to Elise about how she'd loved music before the fever, how she could remember the feeling of it even if she could no longer hear it. Elise was sitting at the instrument, her fingers hesitantly finding notes, when Madame de Clos burst in, her face flushed with agitation. She hurried to Marguerite and began speaking rapidly. Marguerite's expression darkened as she read the maid's lips, and she turned to Lisa with a look of concern. "Laurent is here," Marguerite signed. "He's demanding to see me. Says it's urgent. Should I leave?" Elise signed back. Marguerite shook her head emphatically. "No, stay. I want you here." They went downstairs to the formal salon, a room Lisa hadn't been in before. It was grander than the small salon, with gilded furniture and elaborate mirrors that multiplied the gray light from the windows. Laurent was standing by the fireplace, examining a porcelain figurine with the air of someone cataloging another person's possessions. He turned when they entered, and his eyes swept over Elise with obvious disdain before settling on Marguerite. "Countess," he said, his voice loud and slow, as if speaking to a child. "How delightful to see you." Marguerite's face remained impassive. She gestured for him to sit, but she remained standing, a subtle power move that Elise admired. Laurent sat, spreading his burgundy coat around him. "I'll come straight to the point. There's talk in society about your situation here. Specifically about your hiring this girl." He waved a hand dismissively at Elise. "People are concerned. It's unseemly for a woman of your status to have a common servant as a companion. It makes you look desperate. It makes the entire nobility look weak." Marguerite's hands moved in rapid signs, and Elise spoke for her, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The Countess says that her household arrangements are her own concern and no one else's." Laurent's eyebrows rose. "You presume to speak for her?" "I translate for her," Elise corrected. "There's a difference." "Impertinent," Laurent muttered. He turned back to Marguerite, raising his voice even more. "My dear Countess, surely you can see how this appears. This girl has bewitched you somehow. It's not natural, this attachment. What could you possibly have in common?" Marguerite's signs were sharp and angry now. Elise translated. "The Countess says she has more in common with me than she ever had with people like you. She says I see her as a person, not as a curiosity or an embarrassment. She says that's something you and your friends never learned to do." Laurent's face flushed red. He stood abruptly, his small eyes flashing with anger. "You go too far, both of you. The Countess may have a title, but without the respect of society, what is she? A deaf woman living in a house that's falling into decay, spending her inheritance on some street urchin who's probably stealing the silver. Mark my words, there will be consequences for this. This friendship. Society has ways of dealing with those who forget their place." He swept out without waiting to be dismissed, his footsteps heavy on the marble floors. After the front door slammed, the house fell into silence. Marguerite sat down heavily, her elegant posture finally breaking. She looked suddenly older, more fragile. Elise knelt beside her chair, taking her hand. "He's just one cruel man," Elise signed. "His opinion doesn't matter." But Marguerite shook her head. "He's not just one man. He speaks for all of them, for the entire society that decided I wasn't worth their time when I lost my hearing. They want me to disappear, to stay hidden away like an embarrassment." "Then don't hide," Elise signed, the words coming before she'd fully thought them through. "Don't let them make you disappear. You have a title, you have money, you have influence if you choose to use it. Why should you hide because they're uncomfortable? Marguerite looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. What do you suggest? And there, kneeling on the carpet in that grand, lonely house, Elise had an idea. It was audacious, probably foolish, and would definitely scandalize everyone. But looking at Marguerite's face, at the hope and fear warring in her eyes, Elise knew it was the right thing to do. We go out, she signed. We go to the places where they gather. The gardens, the promenades, the cafes. We show them that you're not hiding anymore. And we communicate openly in front of everyone. We show them that being deaf doesn't make you less than them. We make them see you. Marguerite's hands trembled as she signed. They'll mock us. They'll be cruel. Probably, Elise agreed. But they're already cruel. At least this way you won't be alone. For a long moment Marguerite said nothing. Then slowly she smiled. It was a smile that held both fear and determination, the smile of someone who'd been backed into a corner and had finally decided to fight back. Very well, she signed. Let's show them. The next day was Thursday, and the weather had turned surprisingly fair. Sunlight actually broke through the perpetual gray clouds, bathing Paris in golden light that seemed to promise new beginnings. Marguerite spent the morning preparing as if for battle, choosing her finest dresser creation in deep, emerald green with intricate gold embroidery that caught the light with every movement. Her hair was arranged in elaborate curls, pearls woven through the blonde and silver strands. She looked every inch the Countess, and Elise could see the armor in it, the way Marguerite was reclaiming her nobility as a shield. For Elise, Marguerite insisted on providing a new dress. It was still appropriate for a companion rather than a noblewoman. A soft gray-blue muslin with a cream-colored shawl, but it was finer than anything Elise had ever worn. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the young woman staring back, her chestnut hair arranged neatly, her face framed by fabric that didn't carry the stains of hard labor. You look lovely, Marguerite signed when Lisa came to her chambers. Then, with a slight smile, are you ready to scandalize Paris? As ready as I'll ever be, Elise signed back, though her stomach was churning with anxiety. They decided to start with the Jardins des Tuileries, the formal gardens where the aristocracy gathered every pleasant afternoon to see and be seen. It was the heart of Parisian high society, the place where reputations were made and destroyed with a whispered word or a pointed snub. If they were going to make a statement, this was where it needed to happen. The carriage ride felt both too long and too short. Lisa watched the streets pass by, the familiar buildings of her old life giving way to the grander architecture of the aristocratic quarters. Marguerite sat across from her, hands folded in her lap, her face serene but her knuckles white with tension. When they arrived at the gardens, Madame de Close, who'd accompanied them with deep misgivings, helped them down from the carriage. The gardens spread before them in geometric perfection, pristine gravel paths bordered by perfectly manicured hedges, topiaries cut into elaborate shapes, fountains sending arcs of water into the air, and everywhere people, the nobility of Paris in their finest clothes, parading along the paths, gathering in small groups to gossip, arranging themselves on benches to display their jewels and their importance. Elise could feel the eyes turning toward them immediately. Marguerite was known, of course. Her title and her isolation had made her a figure of whispered speculation. And now here she was, emerged from her self-imposed exile, with a young woman at her side who was clearly not a lady's maid but something else entirely. Marguerite took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began to walk. Elise fell into step beside her, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. They moved along the main path, passing groups of elegantly dressed men and women who fell silent as they approached, then burst into whispers once they'd passed. They were perhaps 50 yards into the garden when they encountered the first direct confrontation. A woman in a stunning dress of pale pink silk, her powdered hair towering a foot above her head in an architectural marvel of curls and ribbons, stepped directly into their path. Elise recognized her, the Marquise de Fontaine, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her influence at court. The Marquise spoke, her lips moving in an exaggerated way that suggested she knew Marguerite could read them. Elise caught enough to understand. How brave of you to venture out, Countess. And with such unusual company. Marguerite's hands moved in a fluid response, and Elise translated aloud. The Countess says she's tired of hiding away simply because some people lack the imagination to communicate with her. She says she has as much right to enjoy these gardens as anyone. The Marquise's eyebrows rose. The girl speaks for you? How quaint. Tell me, Countess, does she also dress you and feed you? Where does one draw the line between companion and nursemaid? The cruelty in her tone was casual, thoughtless, and it made Elise's blood boil. But before she could respond, Marguerite's hands were moving again, her signs sharp and decisive. The Countess says, Elise translated, her voice carrying clearly, that at least she chose a companion who treats her with respect and kindness, rather than surrounding herself with people who mistake cruelty for wit and gossip for conversation. The Marquise's face flushed, and several people nearby had the grace to look uncomfortable. But the woman recovered quickly, her smile turning brittle, charming. Well, do enjoy your walk, Countess. I'm sure it will give everyone something to talk about for weeks. She swept past them, and they continued walking. Elise could feel her heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins. But when she glanced at Marguerite, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Fierce joy in the Countess's eyes, a kind of exhilaration that came from finally fighting back. They made their way to a fountain at the center of a circular clearing, where several benches offered places to rest. As they sat, more people began to gather at a discreet distance, watching them with undisguised curiosity. Elise could hear the whispers, the speculation. Some of it was cruel, some merely curious, but all of it was attention, the one thing Marguerite had been denied for so long. Then Elise noticed a young woman approaching hesitantly from one of the side paths. She couldn't have been more than 25, dressed in a lovely gown of lavender silk, her face kind and uncertain. She walked up to them and curtsied, then spoke directly to Marguerite, her lips forming words carefully. Countess de Valois? I'm sorry to intrude. My name is Sophie Mercier, my younger sister. She lost her hearing 2 years ago after an illness. We've been struggling to communicate with her. When I heard that someone was using hand gestures to speak with you, I wondered if you might ... double quotes. She trailed off, looking both hopeful and embarrassed. Marguerite's expression softened immediately. She signed something and Elise translated. The Countess asks if you'd like to learn. She says she and I have been developing a language of signs that could help you speak with your sister. Sophie's face lit up with such profound relief that it made Elise's throat tight. Would you? Truly. We felt so helpless. Marimi's sister. She's become so isolated, so sad. We love her, but we don't know how to reach her. Marguerite gestured for Sophie to sit, and for the next 30 minutes. There, in the heart of the Tuileries, with half of Parisian society watching, they taught this young woman the basics of their sign language. Marguerite demonstrated signs for family members, for emotions, for simple needs and wants. Sophie practiced earnestly, her fingers stumbling over the unfamiliar shapes, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. Thank you, she kept saying. Thank you so much. You don't know what this means, but Marguerite did know. Elise could see it in her face, the way something had shifted and opened in her expression. This was what had been missing, not just someone to talk to, but a purpose. A way to take her own pain and isolation and transform it into something that could help others. By the time Sophie left, promising to return with her sister the following week, a small crowd had gathered. And not all of the faces were hostile. Some looked curious, others thoughtful. An elderly gentleman in a bottle green coat approached and bowed formally to Marguerite. Countess, I must apologize. I've seen you at various functions over the years, and I'm ashamed to say I never made an effort to communicate with you. I simply assumed. Well, I assumed incorrectly. What you're doing here, teaching this young woman to speak with her sister, it's admirable. Truly admirable. Marguerite inclined her head graciously, accepting the apology with the dignity of her station. More people came forward after that, not many, and not the most influential members of society, but enough. Enough to show that not everyone was committed to cruelty, that some people were capable of reconsidering their prejudices when confronted with them directly. Of course, not everyone was so gracious. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Laurent appeared with a small group of his cronies. They positioned themselves near the fountain, speaking loudly enough that their voices carried clearly a calculated insult, since they knew Marguerite couldn't hear them, but everyone else could. A public spectacle, Laurent said, his voice dripping with disdain. The Countess has gone from hiding her shame to displaying it like a carnival attraction. And with that little serving girl translating, it's grotesque. One of his companions, a thin man with a pointed nose and mean eyes, laughed. Perhaps they'll charge admission next. Come see the deaf Countess and her performing monkey. The words hit Elise like a physical blow. She felt Marguerite stiffen beside her, saw the color drain from her face. For a moment, Elise thought they would leave, that the cruelty had finally broken through Marguerite's newfound courage. But then Marguerite stood, her posture rigid with anger, and walked directly toward Laurent and his group. The men fell silent, clearly not expecting this confrontation. Marguerite stopped in front of Laurent, looked him directly in the eyes, and began to sign. Her hands moved with precision and fury, each gesture deliberate and unmistakable. Lisa hurried to her side and translated, her voice shaking but clear. "The Countess says that you are a coward. She says you mock those who cannot defend themselves because it makes you feel powerful, but the only thing it demonstrates is your own weakness and cruelty. She says she has spent 20 years letting people like you make her feel ashamed of something that was not her fault, but she is done. She is done hiding. She is done pretending that your opinion matters. She says she has more dignity in her silence than you have in all your words." The gardens had gone completely quiet. Everyone was watching now, this confrontation between a deaf countess and one of society's most notorious gossips. Laurent's face had turned a mottled red, and his hand tightened on his walking stick until his knuckles were white. "You forget yourself," he hissed. "Both of you." The natural order, but Marguerite cut him off with a sharp gesture. And Elise translated, "The Countess says the only unnatural thing here is a society that values a person's ability to hear over their ability to think, to feel, to love. She says she pities you because you will never understand what it means to truly communicate with another human being. You only know how to wound." Laurent looked as if he might strike her. Lise saw his hand raise, saw the fury in his eyes, but the elderly gentleman in the green coat stepped forward. "That's quite enough, Laurent," he said firmly. "The Countess has every right to defend herself against your boorishness. I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself further." For a moment the tension hung in the air like a living thing. Then Laurent spun on his heel and stalked away, his cronies trailing behind him like confused ducklings. The crowd began to disperse, the show over, but Elise could hear the whispers now, and they weren't all negative. Some people were defending Marguerite, arguing that Laurent had gone too far, that perhaps the Countess had a point about society's treatment of those who were different. Marguerite stood very still for a moment, then her shoulders began to shake. For a terrible second Lisa thought she was crying, but then she realized the truth. Marguerite was laughing. Silent laughter that made her whole body tremble, the release of 20 years of pent-up anger and frustration and fear. Elise took her hand and Marguerite squeezed it tightly. Then she signed, her hands still shaking slightly. That felt wonderful. Terrifying, but wonderful. They left the garden shortly after, but the walk back to the carriage felt different than the walk in. Marguerite held her head high, acknowledging the stares and whispers with regal nods rather than trying to ignore them. She had reclaimed something that afternoon, not the approval of society, because that might never fully come, but something more important. Her own sense of worth, her own dignity. That evening, back in the quiet safety of Marguerite's home, they sat together in the small salon as twilight deepened outside the windows. Neither of them spoke, or signed for a long time. They simply sat in comfortable silence, processing everything that had happened. Finally, Marguerite's hands began to move. "I was terrified today. Part of me wanted to run back to the carriage the moment we arrived, but then I saw how people looked at you when you translated for me. Not with pity or disgust, but with understanding. Like they were finally seeing me as a person who simply communicates differently. You are a person," Elise signed back. "You always were. They were the ones who were blind. And you," Marguerite continued, "you stood there and translated my anger, my pain, my defiance without flinching. You made yourself a target alongside me. Why?" Elise thought about Thomas, about all the times she'd been too young or too afraid to defend him properly, about the regrets she carried, because no one should have to face that cruelty alone, because standing up for what's right matters more than staying comfortable, and because she paused, finding the right signs, because you're my friend, and friends stand together. Marguerite's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I haven't had a friend in 20 years. Well, you have one now," Elise signed, "whether society approves or not." They sat together as the room grew dark, neither of them bothering to light the lamps yet. Outside, Paris continued its eternal rhythm, the aristocrats in their grand houses, the workers in their tiny rooms, the river flowing past it all with indifferent patience. The city didn't care about one deaf countess and one servant girl who'd become friends across an impossible divide, but they cared. They had found each other in the silence, and that was enough. Over the following weeks, something unexpected began to happen. Sophie Mercier returned with her sister Marie, a shy girl of 17 with frightened eyes and hunched shoulders. Marguerite and Elise spent hours teaching them both to sign, watching as the sisters discovered they could talk to each other again, really talk, about more than just basic needs. The joy on Marie's face when she realized she could express complex thoughts and emotions, that she wasn't trapped. Forever in isolation was so profound it brought tears to everyone's eyes. Word spread, quietly at first. Another family came, then another, a middle-aged merchant whose son had been born deaf. a young couple whose elderly father had lost his hearing and had become depressed and withdrawn, an aristocratic family whose daughter had survived the same scarlet fever that had taken Marguerite's hearing, and who was now facing the same social exile. Marguerite's home, which had been so quiet and empty for so long, began to fill with people. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, the small salon became a classroom. Marguerite and Elise taught sign language, helped families learn to communicate, gave hope to people who'd thought they had none. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The Countess, who'd been shunned by society, had created her own society, one based on understanding rather than judgment. Not everyone approved, of course. Laurent and his circle continued to mock them, spreading rumors that the Countess had gone mad, that she was being manipulated by a scheming servant girl, that the whole thing was somehow indecent. But their voices seemed to matter less and less. The families who came to learn didn't care about scandal. They cared about being able to talk to their loved ones. Madame de Clos, watching all of this unfold, gradually softened her disapproval. She even began learning some signs herself, though she grumbled about her old fingers being too stiff for such nonsense. One evening, Elise caught her saying goodnight to Marguerite instead of speaking, and the smile on the Countess's face was radiant. 3 months after that first day in the Tuileries, on a crisp autumn afternoon when the leaves were turning gold and the air had that particular Parisian clarity that made everything look sharper and more beautiful, Elise and Marguerite were walking through the Place de Vosges. The symmetrical square with its brick facades and neat arcades had become one of their favorite places, public enough to make a statement, but more intimate than the vast gardens. They were discussing their plans for the next week's lessons when a carriage pulled up beside them. A footman jumped down and opened the door, and to Elise's shock, the elderly gentleman in the green coat from the Tuileries stepped out. She'd learned since that first day that he was the Comte de Beaumont, a man with considerable influence at court. He bowed formally to Marguerite. "Countess de Valois, forgive the interruption. Might I have a moment of your time?" Marguerite nodded graciously, and the Comte continued, speaking slowly and clearly so she could read his lips while Elise signed the words. "I've been watching what you've been doing these past months. Teaching families to communicate, giving hope to people who felt hopeless. It's remarkable work, and it's made me think a great deal about how society treats those who are different." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I have some influence with the king's ministers. I'd like to propose establishing a formal school, a place where deaf children could be educated, where they could learn not just to communicate but to read, write, think, where they could be given the same opportunities as hearing children. But such a school would need leadership. It would need someone who understands both the aristocratic world and the world of the deaf. Someone like you." Marguerite's hands flew to her mouth in shock. Elise could barely breathe. A school? Official recognition? It seemed impossible. The Comte smiled at their reaction. "I know it's a great deal to consider. The king would need to approve it, and there would be many obstacles. But I believe it could happen. I believe you could make it happen. Will you at least think about it?" Marguerite's hands trembled as she signed, and Elise translated, "The Countess is honored beyond words. Yes, she will think about it. She will do more than think, she will help make it happen." After the Comte left, Marguerite and Elise stood in the center of the Place des Vosges, the brick buildings rising around them in perfect symmetry, the autumn sun slanting through the arcades. Marguerite turned to Elise, and her signs were slow, weighted with emotion. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't stepped forward that day in the flower market. If you hadn't seen me as a person worth talking to. You changed my life, Elise. You gave it back to me." Elise felt tears on her cheeks. "You changed mine too. You gave me purpose. You showed me that the language I created with Thomas, that it mattered, that it could help people, that he mattered." They embraced there in the square, a countess and a former servant girl. Two women who'd found each other across the impossible divide of class and circumstance. People passing by stared, but neither of them cared anymore. They'd learned that true connection was more valuable than approval, that human dignity was more important than social convention, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply see another person, really see them, and treat them with the respect and kindness that every human being deserved. As winter approached and the first snow began to fall on Paris, covering the gray stones in soft white, work began on establishing the school. It would take time, years probably, to navigate the bureaucracy and secure full royal approval, but it would happen. Marguerite threw herself into the planning with fierce determination, and Elise worked at her side, helping to develop a formal system of sign language that could be taught consistently, drafting proposals, meeting with families who wanted their children to attend. The house that had been so quiet and sad became a place of constant activity and hope. The rooms that had sat empty under holland covers were opened and aired. The harpsichord was tuned and played again because Marguerite discovered that even though she couldn't hear the music, she could feel the vibrations, and that was enough. The garden, which had grown wild, was tamed, but not forced into rigid formality. Marguerite said she preferred it with some wildness, some refusal to conform to expectations. Laurent and his circle continued to sneer and mock, but their power to wound had diminished. They were yesterday's cruelty, yesterday's narrow-mindedness. The world was changing, slowly but surely, one conversation at a time, one family learning to sign to their deaf child, one person deciding that difference wasn't something to fear, but something to understand. On a cold December evening, with snow falling softly outside and a fire crackling in the small salon, Elise and Marguerite sat together reviewing the latest plans for the school. Madame Duclos brought them hot chocolate, signing "Here you are" as she set down the tray. And Marguerite signed back "Thank you," and both women smiled at this small, ordinary miracle. Later, as Elise prepared to retire to her room, Marguerite signed to her, "Do you remember what you said that first day in the carriage? You said I was human, that of course I was human. It seems so obvious, doesn't it? But I'd almost forgotten. It's 20 years of being treated as less than, and I'd almost started to believe it. You reminded me. You saved me. We saved each other," Elise signed back. "You gave me a home. You gave my brother's death meaning. You showed me that kindness and connection can change the world." That night, lying in her comfortable bed in the house that had become her home, Elise thought about how strange life was, how one moment of compassion could ripple outward in ways you could never predict. If she hadn't learned to sign with Thomas, if she hadn't stepped forward in that flower market, if she'd done what society expected and kept her head down and stayed invisible, none of this would have happened. Marguerite would still be alone, Sophie's sister Marie would still be isolated, and the school they were planning would never exist. But she had stepped forward. She'd chosen connection over caution, kindness over conformity, and in doing so she'd discovered that the greatest barriers weren't the ones society built between classes or the ones that separated the deaf from the hearing. The greatest barriers were the ones in people's hearts, the refusal to see each other as fully human, the comfort of cruelty, the ease of looking away from others' pain. Breaking down those barriers took courage. It took risk. It meant making yourself vulnerable, opening yourself up to mockery and rejection. But it was worth it. It was always worth it. Outside, snow continued to fall on Paris, on the grand houses and the tiny attic rooms, on the elegant gardens and the muddy streets, on the aristocrats and the servants and everyone in between. The city slept, dreaming its dreams of empire and revolution, art and cruelty, beauty and squalor. And in one limestone house in the Marais, two women who'd found each other in silence slept peacefully, knowing that tomorrow they would wake and continue their work of building bridges where society had insisted only walls could exist. The morning would come with its challenges and joys, its small victories and inevitable setbacks. There would be more Laurents to face, more obstacles to overcome. The school might take years to fully establish. Society might never completely accept what they were doing. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth they'd discovered, that every person deserved to be seen, to be heard even in silence, and to be treated with the dignity that was their birthright simply by virtue of being human. And if two women from completely different worlds could find friendship and purpose together, if they could create something beautiful and meaningful out of loss and isolation, then perhaps there was hope for a better world. Not a perfect world, perfection was impossible, but a kinder one, a more understanding one. A world where people took the time to really see each other, to really connect, to really care. That hope sustained them through everything that followed. And years later, when the school finally opened its doors and deaf children walked into classrooms where they would be educated and valued, where they would learn to read and write and think and dream without apology, Marguerite and Elise stood together watching, their hands intertwined, their hearts full. They had started with a simple gesture in a flower market, a moment of recognition between strangers. They had built from that moment something lasting, something important, something that would outlive them both. They had proven that silence could speak volumes, that barriers could be broken, and that the most powerful force in the world wasn't wealth or status or position. It was the simple human decision to reach across a divide and say, in whatever language necessary, "I see you. You matter. You are not alone." The morning would come with its challenges and joys, its small victories and inevitable setbacks. There would be more Laurents to face, more obstacles to overcome. The school might take years to fully establish. Society might never completely accept what they were doing. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth they'd discovered, that every person deserved to be seen, to be heard even in silence, and to be treated with the dignity that was their birthright simply by virtue of being human. And if two women from completely different worlds could find friendship and purpose together, if they could create something beautiful and meaningful out of loss and isolation, then perhaps there was hope for a better world. Not a perfect world, perfection was impossible, but a kinder one, a more understanding one, a world where people took the time to really see each other, to really connect, to really care. That hope sustained them through everything that followed. And years later, when the school finally opened its doors and deaf children walked into classrooms where they would be educated and valued, where they would learn to read and write and think and dream without apology, Marguerite and Elise stood together watching, their hands intertwined, their hearts full. They had started with a simple gesture in a flower market, a moment of recognition between strangers. They had built from that moment something lasting, something important, something that would outlive them both. They had proven that silence could speak volumes, that barriers could be broken, and that the most powerful force in the world wasn't wealth or status or position. It was the simple human decision to reach across a divide and say, in whatever language necessary, I see you. You matter. You are not alone. The snow continued to fall on Paris that winter, covering the streets where a young maid had once walked invisible, the gardens where a lonely countess had finally found her voice, and the house where two souls had discovered that friendship needs no sound, only understanding, courage, and an open heart.